When we started as a nation more than 1,000 years ago, we had what Western scholars used to call God kings, because the kings then were gods. They represented everything, including the gods. So everything was centered on the king. And I think that it is one of the reasons why we were so strong, because the people united all around the king. You know, even the intellectuals, they were very obedient to the king. So the king could then lead the people on the way towards more and more strength, and we became an empire. We got from India a heavy and beneficial influence. For instance, Angkor Wat, the most famous temple in Cambodia, was inspired by the Indian culture and the architecture and the prayers of the priests and so on. The religions, Brahmanism, Buddhism, were all from India. It is very fascinating because there was a Hindu Khmer marriage without any military means, conquest and so on. Even our monarchy was half Indian and half Khmer.
And patronage radiated from the king down through his courts to peasants in the countryside. Cambodia's strength as an empire was based on rice. The great god kings had power to mobilize labor. Complex irrigation works were built. Up to 3 crops of rice a year were harvested. It was the divine role of kings to fertilize the fields, harmonize the seasons. It also followed that times of drought, political upheaval, or defeats in battle were signs that a king's divine energy had drained away. Then loyalties broke down. Even at the height of its glory, Cambodia's fortunes oscillated according to the personal charisma of each of the Angkor kings. By the 15th century, the empire had collapsed. The royal courts and rituals survived, but the potency of the god kings had clearly faded. A more personal form of Buddhist faith took root in Cambodia.
Before we were Brahmanist, Buddhist, but not Hinayana. Hinayana Buddhism preaches, you know, tolerance, non-violence, and the renunciation to strength, to force. So we became weak.
In popular songs and drama, the villains who threatened Cambodia were always its neighbors, the Thais or the Vietnamese. The art of survival was to play off one against the other. This play tells the story of one Cambodian king who married a Vietnamese princess. It was a marriage of convenience to seal an alliance with the Vietnamese. But according to the play, the king was outwitted by his Vietnamese wife. She insisted on taking Cambodian land to form what is now the south of Vietnam. Cambodia's kings were no longer warriors. They learned to live by compromise and appeasement. It would be the Vietnamese who posed the ultimate threat to Cambodia. Originally from China, the Vietnamese had pushed southwards, but their expansion to the west was checked by mountain ranges. So this natural barrier came to separate the two different cultures of Indochina. The Vietnamese were populous, imbued with Chinese realism. By contrast, the Thais, the Lao and Cambodians clung to their Indian beliefs and culture. They were less worldly and worked their land at a gentler pace. As Vietnamese numbers increased, they needed more land. Cambodians feared their ambitions.
You know, there was and there is still racial antagonism between the Vietnamese and the Cambodians. The main reason why we cannot understand each other or like each other is simply of a military nature. The Vietnamese, they are very expansionist, militarist. They are conquerors, conquérants in French. So we, the Cambodian, we are pacifist. We like peace. So when we see people so among us, really we feel very uncomfortable vis-à-vis such a people.
Ironically, it was the arrival of the French that saved Cambodia from disappearing altogether. Cambodia's king actually welcomed the French when they colonized Indochina in the 1860s. He submitted to France. The kingdom became a protectorate. But that was a lesser evil than losing Cambodia completely to the Vietnamese. For their part, it suited the French to preserve Cambodia's royal courts. They'd keep Indochina divided and use figurehead kings to endorse their rule. The last thing the French wanted was to stir up political change.
The French used to be called the colonialists, but like the Hindus, they did not try to force us to be French. They came and they were helping us in the process of safeguarding Khmer civilization, Khmer culture. And so very freely we chose also to be French educated, to speak French alongside the Khmers and so on.
As a young prince, Sihanouk was one of the privileged few to see any benefits at all from colonial rule. In 1941, at the age of 18, Sihanouk was chosen by the French to be king. In favouring Sihanouk, they'd passed over a rival branch of the royal family because they imagined the prince would be easily controlled. He was more concerned with affairs of the heart than matters of state.
Since I was the only child, my parents, they wanted me to be happy. And after that, there are Westerners who like to say that I was a playboy and so on, because I used to have a good life, so I am accustomed to good cuisine and sports cars and so on. But
the French were pleased to indulge his whims. Although Sihanouk held no power, nonetheless he was revered as a god king. His role was to serve as patron and perform the ancient rituals. For most Cambodians, even figurehead kings were the source of all fertility. Just to touch his robes or the dust at his feet was a blessing with royal potency. For peasants in the countryside, life would barely change at all during 90 years of colonial rule. The French were not concerned with village life. They built roads and plantations, and apart from that, they simply collected taxes. The rest was ignored. Even schools